This is a Sports Catastrophe production. Hey there, Heather, ho there, it's Jeff Gooder, and welcome you to another Sports Catastrophe on this date. And on this day, November 16th, in the year 1926, a new NHL team came in. It is the New York Rangers. As a member of the Blue Shirt Underground radio, sorry, my apologies, the Blue Shirt Underground show with Jim and Eddie, Facebook and YouTube page, I can attest that, we talk a lot about Rangers and we care about the Rangers a lot. Unfortunately, we get pissy when we lose. We get pissy when we win. It's just weird. So I tried talking to BSU about anything cool. And unfortunately, BSU said, you know what? We don't want to help. But that's okay. All right, so it's 1926. And the New York Rangers were playing. The story of how the Rangers came into existence came because of one man, Lester Patrick. But it also became because of another New York team called the New York Americans. Maybe confused, but here's why. The NHL always wanted to expand to the United States. So in 1925, they added a team in Boston, even though they had another expansion team in Montreal called the Maroons. But the New York Americans ended up playing, well, in New York, and the Americans are not the Rangers. They're different. The New York Americans were born because Hamilton got pissy over a pay dispute and didn't compete in the 1925 playoffs. They were the winners of the one division. If Hamilton had played, maybe Hamilton would have played for a Stanley Cup. But anyway, Hamilton didn't. And this was huge. So Bill Dwyer, who made his money through bootlegging during Prohibition, said that he would buy up the whole Hamilton roster and everything for $75,000. A small fee today, but this is 1925 after all. So after he did, and every player was told to make an apology to the league and pay a fine so that they could play for the New York Americans, they played. So for one season, they looked pretty good and all that. So that success also led to Tex Rickard thinking that New York needs another hockey team, this time kind of owned by Madison Square Garden, and an expansion team, and not some stupid fluky team that picked up players because of a strike. Anyhow, the New York Rangers would go on to get some key players. Now, as an expansion team, there's nothing like an expansion draft. So thankfully, Lester Patrick had connections because he and his brother Frank ran the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, one of the leagues that challenged for the Stanley Cup before the NHL claimed ownership of the Cup in 1927. So using the PCHA rosters, they got some very good players. It was pretty impressive and all of that. Through the dispersal of the Western Hockey. Well, the Western Hockey League had dispersed too. The Cook brothers, Bill and Bud, came from Saskatoon. Frank Boucher from Vancouver, of the WHL, mind you. Leo Borcuno from Saskatoon. Murray Murdoch, who was part of a Murray Cup champ in 1923 and would score the winning goal in 1933 for the Stanley Cup. Paul Thompson came off of Memorial Cup. Taffy Abel, part of the American team in the 1924 Olympics. And Stan Brown, part of the Toronto Allen Cup team. Oh, did I mention that Conn Smythe actually was part of the Rangers organization for a while? So he signed some players from the Minneapolis Millers, the amateur team, including Gene Johnson, and also Cooney Whalen and Tiny Thompson. Well, the other teams in the NHL of the future. So they did training camp. Unfortunately, Conn Smythe got booted because of his refusal, allegedly, to sign Babe Dye from the Toronto hockey team. Smythe thought that Dye would not work out, or I don't remember. Yeah, and then, the Rangers said, screw it, you're gone, we'll give you a severance package. So they did. Little did they know that the severance package would be used in kind for Conn Smythe to take control of the Toronto hockey team, known at that time as the Toronto St. Pats, and making sure that the Toronto team didn't move to Philadelphia. And on Valentine's Day 1927, he renamed them the Maple Leafs. So Lester Patrick did his job and all that. Frank Patrick went for Boston. So anyway, the Rangers weren't the only team to join that time. Well, they would be joined in the American Division by Boston, the team that started in 1924, the Blackhawks, who started in 1925, well, 25-26, Pittsburgh, who started the same year as the Rangers, I think, and the Detroit Cougars, well, now called the Red Wings. So, on opening night at Madison Square Garden, not the Madison Square Garden we know, but Madison Square Garden 3, as they call it. The current one is MSG 4. Frank Boucher and Nell Stewart took a ceremonial face-off as the Rangers would take on the Maroons. The great future Canadian writer Lou Marsh, whose name was supposed to be on the name of the best athlete of Canada, but people are asking for it to be removed because of this racist rhetoric in the 1930s, which, okay, it's a racist rhetoric. But this was the 1930s. Things were different. Anyway, the Rangers started Frank Boucher, the Cook brothers, Bill and Bud, Shane Johnson, Taffy Abel, and Hal Winkler in the net. The front six. And the Rangers ended up winning the game 1-0. So it was the start of something good. And it also was a big start for the Rangers because in their first season, they went 25, 13, and 6. It was a 44-game season, and they crushed the American Division by 11 points to win the division. They had a strong January. They were 8-1-2. So the Rangers would get a bye and get to the semifinals of the Stanley Cup, where they would deal with Boston. At the time, it would be 2 games, total goals, 1 game at each arena. The Rangers and Bruins couldn't decide game 1. It was 0-0. And the Rangers went home after a 0-0 tie against Boston and lost 3-1. So Boston got to the Stanley Cup Finals. They ended up losing that series to the Senators, the old Ottawa Senators, mind you. And, well, that wasn't good for the Rangers. However, Bill Cook did well. 33 goals, 4 assists. Now, assists were not handed out like candy as they are now. Frank Boucher put up 28 points, and Bud Cook put up 23 points. It's worth noting Lester Patrick actually played 1 game on defense. In the playoffs, the only goal scorer was Bill Cook. Hal Winkler started the first game for the Rangers, but he would be ended up traded later on to Boston, I believe, because I know he played for Boston. Winkler was 3-4-1. Lawrence Chabot, or what the Rangers tried to make him, Lawrence Chabot-Ski, was a good goalie, and he would be the Rangers goalie for many years. He was the main goalie. Now, the New York Rangers would go on to get to the Stanley Cup Finals in their second year of existence, in 1928. And that was the famous series that saw the Montreal Maroons face them in the finals and Lawrence Chabot go down with injury. The Rangers tried to find a goalie in the stands, but the Maroons, knowing that if they allowed that to happen, they could lose the Stanley Cup, said, you can't take these players. So, logically, Lawrence Chabot was hurt. And then Lester Patrick said, screw it, I'm going to go in the nets. And despite Patrick in the nets, the Rangers ended up winning 2-1 in overtime. They win the game, and then they ended up getting Joe Miller from the New York Americans on loan to be their goalie, and the Rangers won the Stanley Cup. We have a goalie from a rival team. Still, the Rangers in the 30s were decent. In 1932, they lost the Stanley Cup to the Leafs, but then they bounced back with a goal in 1933. I would say Murray Murdoch would be the goal scorer, but that's not right. Who is it? Ott Heller, that's it. Because Josh Gimble of Blue Shirt Underground of BSU said that, he was related to Ott Heller and even has a 1930s New York Rangers jersey of him. I'm like, holy fuck. Well, anyway, the Rangers would win the Stanley Cup in 1940 from the Leafs in Game 6 thanks to Brian Hextall's goal. But little did anyone know that the Rangers were going to go through 54 years of hell before getting their cup for the first time. And that was the longest Stanley Cup drought in history until the Leafs have just surpassed it this year. So anyway, the Rangers went through a period of change in the 40s. The war decimated their roster. They were terrible, especially in 1942 and 1944. Both years they sucked. They had a 15-game losing streak at one time. They ended up losing a game 15-0 to the Detroit Red Wings at one point. Things looked bad for the Rangers. Slowly they would build their team upwards in the 50s, but they still couldn't compete with Montreal or Detroit or Toronto. So the Rangers were basically the forgotten franchise alongside Chicago and Boston. The Rangers had some success in the 60s and all that, but not too much. Soon they got back to the way it is. A new arena, Madison Square Garden 4, changed things up. And major signings like Harry Howe, Sean Rattel, Rod Gilbert, Vic Hadfield, Eddie Giacomin, Jim Nielsen. You know, they had some good players. Brad Park, Rod Seeley. So, excuse me. So the Rangers in the 60s and 70s were okay. The Rangers got back at it. In 1970, they looked pretty good to make a stab for the Stanley Cup Finals. But unfortunately, I forget who. Brad Park was involved in a friendly fire collision, and he was hurt. So the Rangers lost their plot. The Rangers actually did get to the Stanley Cup playoffs in 1970 thanks to the stupid tiebreaker for goals for and not goal differential or record and all that. Because of that tiebreaker, they took care of the Habs in goals scored. The Rangers in 1972 had a chance, but a couple of their star players got hurt. I think it was Rattel who got hurt. Was it Rattel or was it Gilbert? Yeah, I think it was Rattel in 72. That got hurt, and it hindered the Rangers. But the Rangers still got to the Stanley Cup Finals. They took care of the rest of the way. But Boston was just that damn dominant with Orr and Espo and Cheevers. Rangers did put up a fight, but lost in 6 games. The Rangers would limp along. They had a chance to get to the 74 Stanley Cup Finals, but lost Game 7 thanks to Dave Schultz beating up on Dale Rolfe and nobody protecting him. They were basically called chickens and other derogatory names. But the problem was, at the time in the 70s, there would be a rule that if a third man gets into a fight, he would be kicked out of the game and fined $200. So the Rangers didn't want to risk losing people, although they could have had like a third or fourth liner come in and be the sacrificial lamb, and maybe the Rangers would have won in Philly. But no, that didn't happen. The Rangers would be okay, and then they shockingly traded Park and Rattel to Boston for Phil Esposito and Carol Fande. And Joe Sanuzzi. That trade actually did not work out well. Boston got to a couple of Stanley Cup Finals with Rattel and Park. Still, it was hard to see. It's hard to see Rattel and Park in Boston colors, and Espo and Fande in Rangers colors. Although Phil Esposito would be a team leader by the time 79 happened with the Murdoch boys and John Davidson and a host of other characters. As the Rangers shocked the Islanders to get to the Stanley Cup Finals, where they would take care of business in Game 1 against Montreal, sending Ken Dryden from the nets. For the first time in the Habs dynasty, Dryden was chased from the nets. And rumors were that Dryden was going to be benched for Buddy LaRocque in Game 2, but thanks to a Doug Riceborough warm-up shot that hurt LaRocque, Dryden came in and played his heart out in 4 games, and the Rangers were doomed. It also didn't help that Bob Gainey was good and all that. The Rangers were a decent team. In the 1980s, they had some great runs. 86, they had a great run to get to the Stanley Cup semifinals. They shocked a lot of people by taking care of Philadelphia. And I think it was Washington? I can't remember who the second team was. But then they faced Montreal, and unfortunately, just like 7 years prior, the Habs beat the Rangers. But this time, Montreal were more of the underdog. It was the battle of the underdogs, Rangers and Habs. Because the Rangers were massive underdogs for what they did to Philly. And Montreal had a rookie, Patrick Roy, in the nets. Waugh proved his dominance in Game 3 of overtime, saving 10 shots before Montreal won their one shot with Claude Lemieux scored. Habs won that series, went on to win Stanley Cup. The Rangers would rebuild and all that. 92, they won the President's Trophy, and they were the best team in the NHL. They were up 2-1 on the Pittsburgh Penguins, the defending Stanley Cup champs, in the conference semifinals, or the division finals, if you will. And then all of a sudden, a 60-foot slap shot from Ron Francis eludes Mike Richter. And the Rangers lost momentum. They lost the next 3 games. They lost in 6 games. And also didn't help that Adam Graves got 8 games for hurting Mario Lemieux in the playoffs, which kind of was a little too harsh, all that. Lemieux isn't that soft. Regardless, the Kitchener Rangers were not that good either. But anyway, New York had a terrible 93 season. Mark Messier was not too pleased. The Rangers mortgaged everything to get Mark Messier in 91 from Edmonton for the wants of Bernie Nichols and Stephen Rice and Louis DeBrusque. The Rangers would go through a big period in 94. Their Stanley Cup run would be huge because Mike Keaton was their head coach and he benched star players. He even forced Kovalev to take a 6-minute shift, but unfortunately it worked against Keenan because Kovalev was thinking that he was going to get some more ice time. Smooth move, Keenan. Regardless, he made lots of moves. He got rid of Steve Larmer from the Blackhawks. He got many former Blackhawk members, including Stefan Matteau. He got rid of James Patrick, who was a fan favorite, and Mike Gardner also was victimized. And all that. That's fine. For the one of Glenn Anderson, it actually worked out for the Rangers in the end. He wanted playoff-proven people, and that's fine. He traded away Tony Amonte to the Blackhawks for Noonan and Matteau. Okay. But yeah, the Rangers in 94 made a run. First 2 rounds were easy, and then the Devils gave them a hard time. These 2 teams were the best team in the Eastern Conference. And they proved it. Excuse me. 7-game series, Messier's guarantee and hat-trick in Game 6. And then Matteau, Game 7. The Rangers climbed that hill and would face Vancouver in the finals, who were on a Cinderella run of their own as the 7th seed in the Western Conference. Vancouver won Game 1, but the Rangers took the next 3 and then were supposed to win Game 5 on home turf. They lost. They lost in Vancouver, and it was like, oh no, is this a choke job? No, it wasn't. Thanks to Brian Leach's first period goal and Mark Messier's game winner, the Rangers win 3-2. Although it could have been different, as Martin Gelinas and Nathan Lafayette both hit the post in the 3rd period. Rangers finally break the 54-year cup drought. The fans signed Now I Can Die in Peace. Excellent. The Rangers would have a bit of a downturn as Keenan left for St. Louis, and they just nipped the 8th spot in the Eastern Conference. They took care of the 1-seed Quebec Nordiques in the first round, kind of sending Quebec to Colorado, but the Flyers beat them in the second round. Rangers got to the Cup semifinals, aka Conference Finals in 97, but the Flyers and Eric Lindros were just too powerful, although they would be swept by the Red Wings, who ended a cup drought of their own, 42 years. The Rangers would limp. After 97, they went through a playoff drought up to the 2005 strike that killed the season. So after that strike happened, the Rangers would keep making the playoffs, would keep having playoff disappointments and playoff runs, and then, disappointment and all that. And that made a lot of Ranger fans realize pain was on the way. But in 2014, the Rangers shocked everyone by coming back from 3-1 down against the Penguins. I think that was a 3-1 comeback. Oh, yeah. Martin St. Louis with the inspirational goal on Mother's Day. And the Rangers took care of the Habitants in the conference finals. Man, I hate those Habs so much. Not as much as Ottawa, but that's not the point. Anyway, the Rangers, MSL with the overtime goal, and the Rangers winning Game 6, 1-0, facing LA Kings. I think this is it big. The Rangers may have lucked out with LA getting their opponent not be the Blackhawks. Well, unfortunately, I was proven wrong as the Rangers blew multiple goal leads on multiple occasions, and the Kings won in 5 games. Ugh. The Rangers made a run recently to 2022 to the conference finals against Tampa and should have went up 3-0. They were up 2 games to none. They had home ice, and then stupid Jacob Trouba taking a dumb penalty, which ruined the Rangers' momentum. And after that, the Rangers couldn't win a game to save their life, and the Lightning won in 6. But karma bit tap on the butt as Colorado won the Stanley Cup. Yay! But yeah, the Rangers are a fine organization, and so is Blue Shirt Underground Radio or Blue Shirt Underground Show, whatever. But still, they're pals of mine. You can't teach that. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond. I do.